In January of this year, we sent surveys to the 537 CEOs of foundations giving $5 million or more annually in grants. 173 CEOs responded for a 32% response rate. And at CEP, we wondered to what extent was there a response bias here, and who decided to respond and who didn't. When it comes to data about the asset size and giving of foundations from which CEOs did and did not respond, we really don't see a difference. But when it comes to the attitudes that CEOs have towards assessment and what foundations are actually doing to assess their effectiveness, we believe there's some degree of bias here, as evidenced by this one email we received from a CEO to whom we'd sent the survey. She wrote, "Dear Phil, usually I'm pretty good at doing these affinity group surveys, but I got halfway through and it was seriously raising my anxiety about all the things we aren't doing to evaluate our work in a systematic way. Then I closed the window and went back to my other work. Sorry." But what did we learn from the almost 200 CEOs of some of the largest foundations in the country? We learned that CEOs believe assessing the effectiveness of their foundation's performance is a high priority. They believe a lot has been accomplished in the last decade, but still there's a lot of work to be done. We asked CEOs, among the many priorities you have as a CEO, how much of a priority is assessing the foundation's effectiveness? 72% say it's a high priority. And we asked CEOs to explain to us why they place assessing effectiveness where they do in their list of priorities. One CEO who rated effectiveness as a high priority said, "Without understanding our effectiveness, we're rudderless, and we learn nothing from our efforts except perhaps that our spending is appreciated." One CEO who rated assessment as a low priority at the foundation said, "Following up to measure impact or effectiveness of a grant is a fool's game." Compared to where foundations were a decade ago, the majority of CEOs do believe that foundations have made great progress in being able to assess their effectiveness. And still, the majority of CEOs also believe that today too few foundations understand their overall performance. Not everything that CEOs shared with us in this survey was positive when it comes to the topic of performance assessment. Some of the greatest contributions that foundations have made in the past 100 years, they've made because they've taken risks on innovative ideas. And we asked CEOs whether or not they agree with the statement, "There's a tension between foundations focusing more on assessment and the freedom they have to take risks on innovative ideas." 58% of CEOs agree that that tension exists in foundations' work. A recent initiative that's brought this tension to the forefront is the Social Innovation Fund, created by the Obama administration. And the Social Innovation Fund is focusing simultaneously on the importance of evidence and data in philanthropy, as well as on the support of innovative ideas. And the Social Innovation Fund has also been clear that one of its goals is to influence practice in philanthropy broadly. We asked CEOs whether they believe the Social Innovation Fund has the potential to have an important positive influence on foundation practices. 38% said they were too unfamiliar with the Social Innovation Fund to respond, and only 18% agreed. Another topic of conversation these past few years has been whether foundations are focusing too much on data when it comes to decision-making and should be placing more emphasis instead on intuition. So we asked CEOs whether or not they believe foundation staff are relying too much on data and should be placing more emphasis on intuition. Only 19% agree. So when it comes to the attitudes that CEOs have about assessment, it's clear from this data that CEOs believe assessing the effectiveness of their foundation's performance is important. But what are they doing to understand their effectiveness? Our methodology this time around is a little bit different than it was 10 years ago when we first started studying this topic. But our conclusion is that today, foundations are using a broader range of information to understand their effectiveness. When it comes to understanding operations and finances, we asked CEOs whether they were using any of 13 different types of information to understand their operations and finances. Almost every foundation is looking at investment performance and administrative costs. Just over half are looking at indicators of the success of their communication efforts. The kind of information that foundations were least likely to be looking at to understand the effectiveness of their operations is data about the people working at the foundation, the diversity of staff, staff retention rates, and the experiences of staff working at particular foundations. What about when it comes to understanding the effectiveness of their programmatic work? Again, we asked CEOs if they're looking at any of 13 different types of information to understand the effectiveness of their programmatic work. On average, CEOs told us their foundation is looking at 7 different types of information to understand programmatic work. Almost every foundation is looking at anecdotal feedback, written reports from grantees, and information from site visits. Almost every foundation in our survey told us that they're looking at information from evaluations, either evaluations of individual grants, clusters of grants, or evaluations of program areas. And half of foundations looking at evaluations are spending more than 2% of their annual grant-making budget on evaluations. So it's clear that evaluation remains an important component of foundations understanding the effectiveness of their programmatic work. But foundations are looking beyond evaluations to understand the effectiveness of programmatic work. A majority are also looking at other information from grantees, experiences grantees are having with the foundation through surveys, focus groups, and convenings. They're looking at numbers served by grantees and outputs. But the kind of information that foundations are least likely to turn to understand the effectiveness of their programmatic work is information from their ultimate beneficiaries, those the foundation is ultimately trying to have an impact on through their work. And when we look more closely at this data, we notice 2 important differences between foundations that are listening to the experiences of beneficiaries and those that aren't. Foundations that are collecting information from their beneficiaries rated themselves as having a better understanding of how their strategies are actually working than foundations not collecting information from their ultimate beneficiaries. And foundations collecting beneficiary information also rated themselves as having a more accurate understanding of the impact they're actually having through their work than foundations not listening to feedback from beneficiaries. So foundations, on average, are collecting quite a bit of information to understand their operations, their finances, and their programmatic work. But a key question that we had in this piece of research was, well, to what extent are foundations rolling up this information across operations, finances, and programmatic work into an overall foundation performance assessment? So we asked CEOs, does the foundation regularly combine information about effectiveness into an overall performance assessment? 48% of CEOs said yes, their foundation looks at an overall performance assessment. And foundations looking at an overall assessment differ from those that aren't in a couple of ways. First, foundations looking at an overall performance assessment are collecting more types of information to understand their effectiveness than foundations not looking at an overall assessment. And the foundations looking at an overall assessment also told us that the information they're collecting about their operations is more useful to them in actually understanding the effectiveness of their operations. Second, foundations looking at an overall performance assessment also rate themselves as having a better understanding of how their strategies are working than foundations not looking at an overall performance assessment. So we learned from this data that CEOs believe assessing the effectiveness of their foundation's performance is important. And on average, foundations are collecting quite a bit of information to understand their effectiveness. But what about challenges that foundations are facing in this work. Phil mentioned a number of them in his remarks. There's an additional challenge that's come through in a number of research projects that we've done at CEP. We've heard on a few occasions from CEOs that they would like their boards to be more involved in the work of performance assessment. And in our research, we hear the same thing from boards. They want to be more involved in the work of performance assessment. The same story emerged in this data. But this time, we also have a little bit more insight into some of what might be getting in the way of that involvement. Only 27% of CEOs told us that neither they nor the board wants more involvement in assessing the foundation's performance. But 51% of CEOs said that both they and their board want the board to be more involved in assessing the foundation's performance, 51%. Another 19% said they want the board to be more involved than they believe the board wants to be. And I'll share with you the 3 most common reasons that came through in our survey about why boards aren't more involved in the work of assessment. First, the board not having a deep enough understanding of the issue areas in which the foundation funds. Second, the board's expectations for what can be understood about impact don't align with what staff believes is realistically possible to capture. And when I'm talking about involvement here, I'm not talking about involvement just for the sake of involving the board. Because CEOs who listed these 2 reasons as getting in the way of board involvement also rated their boards as having a less accurate understanding of the impact the foundation's actually having in the communities and fields in which the foundation is working than CEOs who didn't list these 2 reasons as getting in the way of board involvement. The third most common reason why boards aren't more involved in assessment is the board not supporting allocating the necessary resources that a useful assessment requires. So what did we learn from this latest data? We learned that CEOs believe assessing the effectiveness of their foundation's performance is a high priority, that a lot of progress has been made in the last decade, but still there's a lot to be done. We learned that foundations are using a broader range of information sources to understand their effectiveness today than they were about 10 years ago. And we learned the continuing challenge that foundations face about how to best involve their boards in the important work of performance assessment. So that's some of what we learned, and of course there's still a lot we don't know. One of the big issues that we continue to examine is to what extent is all of this information being used by foundations to make changes in how they do their work? And to what extent are those changes then leading to increased impact in the work foundations are trying to do? But the story here is a positive one, because foundations, institutions that many in society say are slow to change or will never change, are, in fact, changing. Thank you.